Welcome. We have got a couple of questions lined up that we thought would be valuable in addressing, and I'll get straight into it. As Karim said, we've got Kurt Vermaak, we've got Steve Brown, we've got Adrian Myberg, or is it Stephanus Browns and Kurt Vermaaks, and we don't know. We couldn't get the spelling right earlier, but anyway, there we go. So the first look, and these are just questions that have come up, all of us get phone calls and sort of queries and this sort of thing. So will the PIRB company registration take the place of my IOPSA membership? Is quite a common thing we hear, because one draws a comparison between, the fact that the PIRB is now registering companies, it's the same thing as what IOPSA have been doing, is it not? Well, the short answer is no. There's quite a significant difference, and I know, Steve, I think you are probably best placed to kind of explain that difference, and we can all chip in if we want to as well. I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. I think, again, this was PIRB in the board decision looking at trying to close that gap between the company and the licensed plumber. It's also another mechanism for a company to be able to advertise and be on the actual search engine for PIRB, but it is not, a replacement of IOPSA. It's not about the one or the other. As you've said, Richard, it's free. There's no cost to the company in terms of doing this, but it's just another avenue in terms of being able to search a particular plumbing company that supports or engages with licensed plumbers. So, if you think that you're going to have meetings and different things and specials and everything else, that's certainly not going to be the case. It's merely a registration of the company in terms of, as you said before, Richard, when an individual is trying to search for a licensed plumber, they are not going to be looking for Richard Bailey, Adrian Myberg, or Steve or Kurt. They are basically going to be looking for a particular company that they can basically see employs licensed plumbers, and then the accountability that comes along with that. So again, we've discussed it before, where some of the plumbers that are licensed and employed in that company, there are challenges in terms of audits. There are challenges in terms of understanding where they are in terms of their points. So that's really where that comes down to. And again, there's a matrix and different things behind it in terms of measuring the company in terms of how good, bad, or indifferent. And those can be shared or not shared, but it's free, it's voluntary, and it is not in place of IOPSA. Don't think that where a company is now going to choose not to become be an IOPSA member rather than register with PIRB. There's two totally different deliverables in terms of what's going to be provided, if I can put it shortly like that.
Yeah, and it takes away nothing from the individual registered plumber, which is another important point. That the individual that is registered with the PIRB as a PIRB registered plumber, it takes away nothing from that, and it doesn't change a thing. It doesn't allow the company to take over the role of that individual within that framework.
I think also, Richard, is that when you see what goes on, sometimes the employed or the employee who's licensed is instructed to do work which is maybe not in accordance with the standards or whatever, and he carries the brunt of it. But in terms of the dual between the company and the licensed plumber, is that we can mitigate and work between the two, where the plumber is now not standing out on his own because he followed instructions. So there's a lot of pros that come into that. Some may see it as a negative, but for me, I think it brings the company and the licensed plumber closer. It gives him access to how his audits have been, how he's done, because in essence, I don't think too many of the companies actually know how their employees are fared in terms of passes and fails and COCs issued, et cetera. So yes, we'll have some ironing out problems and we'll learn as we go. But in essence, I think from the majority, it's been seen as a very positive move, and it's come from the plumbing fraternity, and that's why the board have decided to look at that.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a lot of positives, and you know, the intricacies of it, I suppose, for want of a better description, we can chat about it for a long time, and the benefits of it. I mean, both from a company's perspective as well as from the individual plumber's perspective, there's a bit of protection, as you mentioned, etc. So yeah, so there's a lot. I mean, we can spend the rest of this shortened session on it, which I don't think we should. But anyway, thanks, Steve, for that. And I mean, Adrian, I don't know if you're sucking your fourth cup of coffee, but if you guys want to jump in, feel free. Huh? So another one that came up says, how should I mark a replacement geyser within a solar system on the COC? In other words, if I'm called out to go and replace a burst geyser, and that geyser happens to be part of a solar system or a heat pump system for that matter, a lot of times the plumbers, whether it's the plumbers themselves that are under this impression, or whether they receive instructions from the insurer perhaps, or whatever the case may be, to mark that replacement geyser as a 01, an 01. In other words, just a hot water system, a conventional geyser replacement, because in their minds, what they're doing is they're taking a tank out and they're putting a tank in, and they're not touching the existing solar water or the solar system. Now, the problem with that, guys, is that the standards are set up in such a way, and they've got they are set up with protection of the consumer in mind, safety in mind. Now, one of the key functions of a plumber, a professional plumber, especially a plumber that is able to issue COCs and that is licensed and everything like that, one of his key functions as a professional plumber is to have his eyes open and look around him and say, okay, I'm working on this situation and this is wrong. So the standards say, if we work on an installation, that installation must be brought up to current standard. In other words, I have to acknowledge that this is a solar system, and I have to look at it and say, that's not in the right place, this is wrong, this is inefficient, and that's dangerous. And I have to address it, either by way of doing it, and if that's impossible, from a financial or a time or a permission perspective, then I have to note it in a written notice of non-compliance. For that to happen, you cannot therefore pretend that it's a normal geyser installation. It's not. It is a solar system. And if even if you're replacing a vacuum breaker, you were the person on site, you have to look at that entire system and you have to bring it up to standard. The Mrs. Jones thinks that, oh, you're the professional, you've been on site, you've looked at my system and you've said nothing to me, it must be fine. That's not fair, and that is not the intent of the standard. So it's a categorical no, you cannot mark it as a 01. I don't know if anybody wants to add to that.
Just a little side note there, Richard. I think it's important for the guys to note that most of the guys that have been audited or that have been through this audit process, you'll appreciate the fact that if you're looking at a code 1, the questions or the criteria for getting that audit assessed is completely different to what the solar one's going to be. So you can't be working on a solar system and have the questions asked around a normal resistance electrical geyser. So it's important to note that if you tick the right box, that you have the thing assessed properly. That's the, like you say, safety and all the other things accounted for. That can only be done if you do it off the right checklist.
Yeah, and I mean, at the end of the day, Mrs. Jones is sitting with a certificate of compliance for a solar system that says it's a conventional system. How does that work? So now the COC that she is supposed to receive when anybody works on a solar system says it's not even a solar system. So guys, you've got to acknowledge that it is a solar system or a heat pump system and mark it as such. And of course, for you to be able to, with all due respect to everybody, and I know that I'm not talking generally, but with all due respect to those that are not solar qualified or not heat pump qualified, you might miss a few things. And hence the reason for the qualification. So that's the answer to that question. A thing that popped up yesterday, actually, for me was a heat pump manufacturer sent a plumber a design for an installation which was completely non-compliant. So they designed an installation. They said, this is it, and they actually sent it to the client, and the client expected this to be done, and this was about a year ago. It was then subsequently done. Another plumber happened on site yesterday or the day before and came across this installation and said, what on earth is going on here? And they said, no, so-and-so designed it, and here it is. They still had the PDF design sheet from the manufacturer, and it was completely incorrect. And the customer had been struggling with this installation for forever. So I'll put it to the panel. I mean, what do you do as an installer? I have my opinion, or I have my answer, but I'll put it to you guys. What do you do if a manufacturer gives you a design which is incorrect?
I think what we need to do, just as a starting off point, is acknowledge the fact that some of the standards do allow for manufacturers' instructions or manufacturers' design specifications. I think the most important thing is that whether it's done by the manufacturer or whether it's done by an engineer or a competent person, wet services, whatever designation you'd like to allocate to that specific person, none of those designs or specifications or instructions can contravene or can oppose, or contravene is probably a better term, a national standard. So if there's a requirement in a standard for something to be done, not a single manufacturer or a design or competent person can contravene those requirements of that specific standard.
Yeah, which this design did on several points, on several things. It actually contravened completely the standards. So I'm sorry, I forgot to say that, which it actually did contravene the standards. So yeah. The short answer.
Yeah, the short answer is 100% what Adrian was saying there. And I think this goes back to the competency of the installer. Okay, so that individual should have been solo accredited, had gone through the recognized courses, and he should have, asked those relevant questions, at the get-go, in terms of the design. So I think in terms of this, it's exactly what Adrian said, is that, the standards do call for, or as per the manufacturer specifications, but they cannot supersede or contravene the requirements of that standard, and therefore the plumber. And again, I see this often where the plumber doesn't voice his opinion for whatever reason, whether it be for a lack of understanding or detail. Those questions are never really asked. And as we all know, as auditors, when you get to site, the job is finished, and then you start picking these things up. So I think for me, there is enough information available and people available that if the plumber or the installer needs some info, is please go to IOPSA and ask the correct question, speak to your auditor to be able to guide you in terms of that. But again, as you've said, Richard, it's been a year down the line. Now these things start to unpack, and rather sort those things out before you do the installation. And if it is such, then you sign and make sure that you followed that rational or irrational design, or whatever the case may be. You put your concerns on the table and you've noted them.
And I think also the bottom line is that no matter how legitimate something looks, you've always got to do your own due diligence, and you've got to know what you're doing in terms of an installer. If you're going to install a heat pump installation, a heat pump system, you've got to know what it must look like from your perspective. You need to know the standards, and so you can identify these shortcomings. So no matter if it comes from an engineer or a manufacturer or whatever, a manufacturer might have, and I'm not saying all, but the guy might have, intern drawing this pipe work design, and it slips through the cracks and nobody checks it and goes out to the client. Things happen, mistakes happen. So don't take anything on face value from that perspective. It's always the onus is always on the installer. The minute you sign that COC, you personally take responsibility. You say to your client that I have looked at it and I am saying that it is compliant. So and that's so it's important to remember that. Don't just take everything on face value, because it was a completely it would never have worked, and it doesn't work. It hasn't worked. Anyway. Am I allowed to issue my own COC instead of the professional body COC? Steve, this is something that came across your desk recently, I think.
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of discussion around the COC, and I think, and Adrian, please, you being very close to the coalface, I think we need to understand that, there's been a lot of, things up in the air with regards to SABS and the legitimacy of the certificate of compliance from the professional body. But I think the key thing for us is to understand that, if you're applying a standard, that you have to apply the whole standard. You cannot take one thing out and add another. I mean, it's a living document. It's a document that's there. And until such time as it is amended and changed, then, whatever that change is, will come into effect. So I think what we need to realize is the standards are very clear. If you're doing a heat pump, solar, or geyser, it requires the certificate from the professional body, not your own COC. Don't create your own one, because again, the standard requires the professional body COC. And if it does change, and then, the document will then talk about, what those requirements are. But I have seen in the last week, guys trying to do their own COCs on pieces of paper. I've had insurances phone me. I've had many a consumer phoning me saying, well, what is this? So again, the standards are very clear. Until the time as they change, and nothing has changed, these standards need to apply. And don't put yourself at risk. I mean, I saw one the other day that was just a very blasé type document, and it's now been questioned in terms of legitimacy of the insurer, and asking the question, and the plumber hasn't been paid, because the client has submitted it through to the insurer, and the insurer says, sorry, we don't accept this, and that's off you go. So again, we do have the City of Cape Town, and we have to a certain extent eThekwini, but the one is between the city, if I can put it that way, and the plumber. The professional body COC is between you, the plumber, and the homeowner. And I think there's a big difference between the two. So that's just as a heads up in terms of that. Please don't take it as a negative that things are all falling apart, because it's certainly not that way. Adrian, you want to add anything there?
Yeah, I see this question slip onto the screen here, so I'd like to take this question and combine it with the previous one. I know that PIRB have been working on a COC for sale of property, which covers basically from where you walk onto the property, where you see the water meter, recording all of those odds and ends, shut-off valves, the whole thing right throughout the whole property. What the guys have been doing is, and I think there should be a distinction, or that we should make mention of the fact that you are allowed to, at this stage, at the sale of property, to do a report on your own company letterhead, like some of the diligent guys have been doing. You can mention all the faults that you found, or all the stuff that you deem either dangerous or that needs attention drawn to. That report must not be confused with an actual COC. And I think it's also important to note that if you mentioned the Cape Town one, there are municipalities that require the owner of that property to issue to the council that COC. And like you said, the other one is between the plumber himself and the homeowner. So we shouldn't confuse the two separate issues like that. But yes, putting your signature, or taking on the risk of signing for something that you did not do is not only contrary to that COC. You've only got two options when it comes to signing those COC. You either did the work yourself, or you took it over from another qualified guy, and you're finishing it off and you're signing it off. So if it's not between the two of those options, then obviously you are taking a risk, because you might be signing for stuff that you've never even seen, or you couldn't possibly know what has happened in that property before you came onto site there.
Yeah, Adrian, just to touch on that, and I see we're running out of a bit of time here, but I think I've got two cases this week where exactly the same thing has happened, and two different scenarios. One where the plumber had done, minimum work and ticked everything, from drainage all the way through to hot water, stormwater, etc., and only did two items, but signed for everything that on that certificate, saying it was correct. So it was pulled for audit, gone down there, and quite, detailed as we normally do in terms of then the checks and balances. And now that's created a problem, because now that is going to be sitting, it's going to be submitted for the sale of the property. It becomes a challenge. The other one I saw, and again, it goes back to what Richard was saying earlier about knowing the standards. So I went to a site, and I arrived there, and the certificate has been asked for by the engineer in terms, and this is an existing property, and the plumber's gone to site, he's done it, and he's done it fairly well. There was a couple of questions and queries. And then when I was asked to go to site to go and meet with the sort of resident engineer, if you want to call it that, there were a huge amount of items that they had missed because of not understanding the standards. So in terms of that meeting, it then ended up as being a benefit for the plumber, because all those items that he should have picked up because he possibly didn't know the standards were addressed, and then he's got extra work out of it. So I think the more detail we put in and the more the due diligence we put in understanding the standards puts us in a better position to be able to report correctly.
Yeah. Karim, I just want to ask what the kind of general sentiment is out there. We all know we're late. We all know we started late. Are there any shouts and screams for us to end this session? What's the story?
I think let's maybe give it another 3 minutes, and then then we would have had a 25-minute session. All
right. Okay, cool. So this is common. Sticking with the COC theme, often guys are asked to issue COCs for work that they haven't done. So often it is done unseen even, and I must admit, it's happening less and less. I think a year or two, maybe even 3 ago, we would have found quite a few of these instances, but it's happening less and less because the guys are starting to realize the pitfalls. But if you are issuing COCs for work that is not your own, I mean, think of it. You're taking on the responsibility of somebody else's workmanship, and not all of that workmanship is visible. You don't know what's happened inside walls, etc. And we've had a couple of instances where a very good friend of a friend, has said, "Hey, buddy, listen, dude, you've known me for 15 years. You know my work. I just haven't managed to get this, or for whatever reason, I can't get a COC this week, and I have to issue it at 50,000 Rand. Draw is pending on it. Do me a favor, man." And you do so. And we've had recently come across my desk, a guy has been taken to task for a number of hundreds of thousands of rands for a development. And it's not to say he's going to be successful, but I mean, that's the thing. You can be taken to court, taken to the cleaners for a signature, because essentially that is a document that you're signing that is declaring compliance. And if it is shown that it is not compliant, well, then you need to explain yourself. So, yeah, guys, please don't bow to that sort of pressure. The privilege of issuing a PIRB certificate or a professional body's certificate is for you alone and for your work alone. All the work that has been done directly under you and that you've got kind of responsibility for anyway, that's also okay. But not for a third party. I wouldn't say that is ever a good idea. Coach, you've been very quiet. I don't know if you.
No, when you were talking about the COC earlier on, and you mentioned that they must put down all the or note all the non-compliance issues. I think what's also a lot of plumbers go to site, especially the insurance guys, and they change a geyser, and then when you go and do the inspection or the audit, if it's called up, they say, "Yeah, but the insurance company doesn't pay for this, doesn't pay for that." I had a meeting with Foggy and yesterday with Santam, and they are very clear that if there's anything that needs to be done on the system to make it compliant, all you have to do is contact them. They will give you a reference, and that you will get paid to do that. It's not a case of the insurance don't pay for it. They do. You must just get a directive for that. And I think the plumbers must see that as an extra money or extra work for them. It's not that they don't pay. They do pay, but you do need to notify them, and you do need to get a directive from them. What they won't do is, if there was no lagging, they're not going to pay for lagging, because that's changing your Rolls Royce to better tires. They will give you your Rolls Royce and everything around that. And I think that's important for the insurance guys to note.
Okay, just the last thing from my side around those COCs. We deal with it often, far too often, according to me. But most of these developers, remember, there's a difference between a builder that does a single dwelling and you end up working for him, and you're working for a developer that might have 200 units in a complex, or you might have 50 high-rise blocks within a development. If you then get involved with a friend of a friend and you issue a COC, and in most cases, the guys just want a COC for a signature somewhere, and you issue a single COC, please bear in mind that you are responsible for each of those individual units within that complex. So if you have not installed sub-meters, you are 150 units times 2 bore valves, meters, the whole tutti, you down the drain for all of that, especially if you're going to be issuing a single COC for a whole development. Please, guys, stay out of that game.
Yeah, if I can just, sorry, Richard. Last week I did an audit where a plumber had started doing some work on a massive renovation of a house, basically starting from scratch. And this plumber was eventually kicked off site, and a new plumber came on, carried on, and issued the COC for everything. But I have about a 3-page list of refixes to do. So this plumber that took over has not noted anything as non-compliant. And unfortunately, he's in for a lot of money now to go back and rectify, because he signed it and as he had done the work, and he never notified the owner of the work that had been done that was non-compliant. So, you know, it's a expensive lesson to learn now.
Yeah,
no,
I think
100%.
Kurt, with that, and Richard, I think with that, I think that's a tech talk on its own, you know, because it's not the first time, Kurt, that we've actually seen that. And I think between us, gents, I mean, just to help the contractors is maybe we put our heads together and detail what those requirements should be in terms of how do you cover yourself and what do you do. So, yeah, Kurt, thanks for that, because it is a problem. We've seen it all too often, and that's it. Guys, we're certainly running out of time. If we can just touch on that last point and, you know, get going. Richard, you want to jump in there?
Yeah, you mentioned that I think Harry and who else, Steve, is doing a tech talk on.
Yeah, so basically, just to put everybody in the picture, is that in the last couple of weeks, and I'm sure we've all seen it on groups, is that where geysers have caught fire, or there's been fires in roof spaces and even for thatch. Okay, so again, you know, the question was asked of me: is there any standard or written in the standard with regards to you know, working with hot works and roof spaces, etc., etc. And it's very clear it isn't, but it does fall under your OHS, your health and safety, your risk assessment, everything else. So again, just as a point of reference for today, is that if you are working in confined spaces, you are in roof spaces, you are doing hot work, is have that dry powder, a fire extinguisher with you, so that in the event of there being a problem, it may be a faulty gas gun, it may be you turned around and melted something, or you've heated up the timber, whatever it is. But it's becoming more and more. And I've got 3 that I've been made aware of, and we're talking about substantial damage to property. So we are putting this tech talk together just to cover the do's and don'ts in terms of working in confined spaces with hot works.
Steve, if I can just, I've got first-hand experience with this. Last year in January, I had to go and replace a geyser at a house, and a townhouse. And when I got on our way there, I could see smoke billowing. Anyway, we got there, and it was this house, and there were fire engines there and everything. And what had happened is that the day before, they had guys doing waterproofing using the hot torches, the bitumen. And that dropped down into the ceiling and started smoldering. And and the next morning it caught flame, and it burnt the whole top story of the house down. And I was coming to install a geyser, and there I was watching a burning house. So that hot works is a very real problem.
Yeah, and I think also we've all experienced it. You know, we take our handy gas or whatever and we got it in the vertical position, and we can't quite get around the corner, so we invert it. And that, as we see, some of those gas guns become flamethrowers. So again, it's just those points that we've looked at. We're busy putting it together. I think it's very important. Fortunately for the plumbers, and again, it could be another tech talk, but again, fortunately for the plumbers, they do have the relevant insurance in place to be able to cover them. But again, if you've been negligent, well, that's a different story. I mean, I'm not a lawyer or whatever, but that could pose a problem. And they would ask, did you take all the relevant steps? So please, guys, look out for that one. In terms of just us trying to add a little bit more value. Kurt will certainly include you in terms of that conversation. But guys, I think we out of the time now. For those in attendance this morning, thank you. Richard, you want to just close us off?
Yeah, no, thanks very much. Have a great one, and look at almost weekend.
Adios.
Cheers, guys. Keep safe.
Take care, everybody. Cheers, Abe.